All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 29, Section 4, Challenging the Status Quo. So the 1960s saw a new generation of Americans come to age. The generation called the baby boomers. So these are people born pretty much from 1945, that's the end of World War II, through 1964. And this was the generation that was participating in a lot of the social activism of the 1960s. A lot of the major movements like Vietnam and civil rights, which we talked about in previous sections, created a shift, you might say, in the political alignment. The new left emerged, right? So this is a new kind of political movement, you might say. Right and left are typically used to describe the political spectrum. We consider this to be, today anyways, and you really kind of see the formation of this political alignment take place throughout the 1960s. You have on this side what we might call conservatives. On this side, liberals, Republicans, and Democrats, right? So that is kind of the political makeup. The new left emerges as, again, on this left side from the Democratic Party. And the new left has kind of a different political agenda, you might say, than traditional Democrats before the baby boomer generation. The baby boomers come out of the 1950s, so there is a certain material affluence there. Their generation before them is called the greatest generation. This is the generation to experience the Depression, right? So the Great Depression and World War II. The title Greatest Generation comes from the generation that defeated Nazism in World War II, so they get the title the Greatest Generation for that. So the baby boomers are coming out of this, and although there was a lot of material affluence there, remember this was also a generation of conformity. So the 1960s is kind of rebellious in that way, and so the new left is this movement, mostly I'd say by younger people in this, and a lot of it kind of culminates around events like Vietnam and like civil rights, whereas the greatest generation, they were much more influenced by events like the Depression, like World War II. The Students for a Democratic Society is kind of the key organization of this new left. The Port Huron Statement outlines what essentially is their goals: military-industrial complex, poverty, racism. So what does this mean? Most of this is anti-war. So these are people who are against American involvement in Vietnam. Again, poverty, so this might be, something like pro-welfare, so supporters of Johnson's Great Society, and support of civil rights. And, this kind of political agenda, anti-war, calling for the Great Society, calling for civil rights, this makes up more or less the new left. We might also add a concern for the environment here, which, if we look at somebody like President Johnson, who was a Democrat, right? Johnson was a Democrat. Some of these things do hold true. He was in favor of civil rights. He was in favor of the Great Society. But Johnson was also most responsible for the Vietnam War. So President Johnson is not really seen by the new left as being the ideal Democratic candidate. If we think of the old left, which is not really a term, but the old left, we want to think of people like FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, who was much more for the concerns of unions, pro-worker, not really very vocal on issues when it came to civil rights, pretty much tried to kind of dodge that issue, so to speak. So whereas the old left stood for things like Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, pro-union, pro-worker, the new left is much more about environment, anti-war, welfare programs, and for the civil rights movement. You have some of these, this sort of new political activism emerge on college campuses. The Cal Berkeley free speech movement was a big part of this new left movement. Teach-ins were held across college campuses. Teach-ins were, you might say, meetings on the Vietnam War. which they were pretty much, unanimously against the war. You can see these various protest signs here, right, for Vietnam. And this is going to create a political shakeup in the country, the emergence of the New Left, and kind of realign where the political parties stand and what their issues are on in the aftermath of both civil rights and Vietnam. One thing that I mentioned in the previous section was the impact that civil rights had on other social movements, that by participating in the civil rights and seeing the achievements that the civil rights movement gained, other demographics within the United States become much more aware of issues that particularly affect them, probably none more so than the women's rights movement. We talked about women's rights previously. From 1848 until 1920, you might call this the first women's movement. And of course, this movement was to gain the right to vote, right? That was the big kind of push of the movement back, before the 1920s. In 1920, you had an amendment passed that allowed for women's suffrage on a national level. So that movement kind of ended there. The women's movement is revived, and we might say 1960 to around 1980 or something like that. Sometimes called the second women's movement or the second feminist movement. And this movement was, again, kind of kick-started, you might say, with the civil rights movement. But was much more focused on things like employment, education, and sort of other issues related to women in the United States at the time. Again, we talked about the impact of the civil rights. The touching off point of this movement was created by the publication of a book called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. She identified in that book what she called the problem with no name. And that was to say that you had millions of American women across the United States who had materially affluent lives, right? They had the kind of 1950s stereotypical American family, a house, a car, a husband, children, etc., etc. But there was something missing, right? And nobody was talking about what was missing. And she identified this as the problem with no name. And you might say what this was maybe something like purpose or independence, that women in the United States lived for their husbands, lived for their children, but didn't live for themselves. And in order to do that, women needed to have equal opportunities to get jobs that paid well, to live independently, and to obtain education in order to get those good jobs. And so that's really what this movement was focused on. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 included Title VII, which banned discrimination based on sex. I want to say this is Friedan right here. The birth control pill was made widely available in the 1960s. It gave women more control of their family. They could now better plan families around education, plan families around employment. The premier organization for this movement was the National Organization for Women, which of course was involved in a various number of legal and grassroots movements in order to improve conditions for women in the United States. One of the goals was a passage of the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment. So this would be an amendment to the Constitution. Now recall, something like the Civil Rights Act and Title VII, that is a law. An amendment is much stronger than a law. ERA was initially proposed back in the 1920s, never really got enough support. Because of the second women's movement, ERA hits Congress once again, passes Congress, goes to the states for a vote, and eventually gets stalled on the state level. It never actually passes. It's defeated by the 1970s, and that was because some of the women's movement was getting a pushback. You had other more visible sites of social activism in 1968. Women's rights advocates protested the Miss America pageant. This was a protest against kind of what they viewed as harmful stereotypes. And, you know, this would be a movement that would continue, like I said, from the 1960s into the 1970s. By the 1980s, with the defeat of ERA, and I don't know exactly the year that it went down, but I think once an amendment goes to the states, there's a certain time life on it and it could expire. But once the ERA was defeated, in other words, it was not passed by the states to amend the Constitution, we typically would say, okay, this would be the end of the second women's movement. Right?